morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Mouse again here at allpointstv.com, and we're very glad to have you with us this afternoon at 2 o'clock on Monday. Always glad to have you both at this studio and also allpointstv.com, 92.1 on your radio dial. We are going to cover, finally, something we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. We have been flooded with new things coming up all the time, and some current events have to be covered instantaneously, and we try to be current in our programming here at allpointstv.com, so we've been going with the flow, so to speak. Today we're going to get to the topic we've been talking about covering for the last several weeks, haven't gotten around to it. We are going to get around to it today, and that is this topic that has most persons, well, you know, it's not most persons that don't know the dates, but most persons do not understand the reasons behind what is called the Civil War in this country. And so I want to cover that, because if we're going to get this country straightened out, we got to, first of all, unbrainwash ourselves about what we've been taught in these government-run schools. And that is a chore that we've assigned ourselves here at allpointstv.com, at least a program called What's Going On, which is a program that we're doing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Mondays. It's so much to be said about it, and we're going to jump right into it. I wanted to, first of all, I asked this question last week. John and I were talking about it off camera, and I was asking the question, has anyone seen the Confederate Constitution? We know the dates of the so-called Civil War. We know it was fought between 1861 and 1865. But I would doubt if anyone in the listening audience, and probably very few in the country, have ever seen the Constitution that was drawn up by the Confederate States. And I want to cover that because I think that's germane to us understanding what this war is really about. And I always say the so-called Civil War because the idea of a Civil War is something very different than what occurred in those 4 years, 1861, 1865.
I always thought it was...
a Civil War is where you have two or more parties that are, in fact, competing and physically confronting the other parties over the land space, the same land space, and the jurisdiction of the land space thereof. A civil war is not a war when one of the factions is trying to succeed. We don't call the Revolutionary War, for example, in 1776, a civil war. We call it a revolutionary war because the idea was the 13 states or 13 colonies were trying to succeed from the British Empire, and the British Empire said no, and they're now fighting over whether or not that secessionist movement or that independence movement will be allowed to go forward. And of course, the issue was settled on the battlefield, and after 7 years of this war being fought, from 1776 to 1783, the Treaty of Paris was where the British had understood that the military could not sustain itself on their soil, and they then negotiated a peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, and the 13 colonial states, the 13 sovereign states, then declared their independence. So secession is not a civil war. Secession is a war for independence. And we've had two of those wars fought on American soil. One was successful and one was not. The one in 1861 that was fought over a 4-year period of time was not successful. What I want to do, I want to show you, since I said that very few people in this country, and probably none in the listening audience, have seen the Constitution of the Confederate States. I want to show you how closely related to the Constitution of this country, the one that was drawn up in 1787, how closely the two constitutions read. That is, say, the American Constitution and the Confederate Constitution, which I think will make you a little bit more aware of what this war really is about. So, John, can you put on the screen the preamble to the Constitution? Okay, we have it up there?
Yep, it's up there. Can you hear me?
Okay. The preamble to the Constitution, which is a introduction to the Constitution, is not part of the Constitution as such. It's an introduction to it. And it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessing and liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, that's the American Constitution. Here's what the Constitution of the Confederate States of America says. We the people, and you see where it says of the United States in the preamble to the Constitution, it says here in the Confederate States of America Constitution, it says, we the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character. The sovereignty is being declared in the preamble to the Confederate Constitution to make it clear what was intended by the framers. What they're doing here is they are refining what they have viewed as a shortcoming in the Constitution, in the sense that it did not say specifically what was intended. When it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, the Confederate Constitution says, we the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character, in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America. So it reads pretty close to what the Constitution in 1787 drew up and ratified the following year in 1788. So a lot of it mimics the same language. If you go and read the Confederate Constitution, you'll see that in almost all of the particulars, all the major particulars in particular, so it mimics the Constitution almost word for word. Now, let me put up there, since everybody thinks that the war that was fought between 1861 and 1865, says most persons think that war was won over slavery. Let me have John put on the screen Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, which deals with the importation of slaves. And you remember that when the Constitution was ratified in 1787, in order to bring into the Union the slave states, it had to, or at least what it didn't have to do it. What they did in order to bring about consensus in the ratification of the Constitution, what it did was to recognize the institution of slavery in the slave-holding states, and it gave a guarantee in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, that there will be no interference with the importation of slaves for 20 years. Didn't mean it would end after 20 years in terms of the ban against passing a law to end the importation of slaves into the country. It just meant that they could not pass a law prior to that. So from 1787 then, what they're saying in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, is that no law should be passed that would restrict the importation of slavery until 1808. But here's how it reads in the Constitution of the United States. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Let me find that, and I want to read that to you. Okay. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax, and this is always government's primary role, the power to tax. If they can tax it, they're willing to make anything legal. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. So then what that is saying is that you can bring slaves be allowed to be brought into the country from outside the country, basically from Africa, but there will be some importation from some of the territories in the Western Hemisphere. Brazil, where 42% of the slaves were taken. Basically, the slaves were taken, most of the slaves were taken to Brazil, Cuba, and pretty much South America, say the West Indies. The West Indies. So 95% of the slaves brought to the Western Hemisphere were not brought to the United States. Only 5% of the slaves were brought here. So it is saying here then the importation of those persons coming into the country would not be prohibited prior to the year 1808. However, a tax, if the government can tax it, it's willing to legalize it. A tax will be placed upon the importation of those persons, not exceeding $10 per person. Now let me read to you, since you think that the war is over slavery, I'm going to read some words of Abraham Lincoln later, but let me read this to you from the Confederate Constitution. Since everybody is talking about this war is over slavery, so I want you to go and read the Confederate States Constitution. Here's what it says in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, in this document. This is the Confederate document. And I told you it mimics the Constitution of the United States. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 says this: the importation of Negroes of the African race from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states or territories of the United States of America is hereby forbidden. Did you get that? And Congress is required to pass such laws as shall effectually prevent the same. Now, don't forget that the Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 in the Constitution was ratified in 1788. This Constitution then drawn up in 1861. So the slave trade in the United States has already ended. And so in the Confederate States, their Constitution starts off with a prohibition. I'll read it again to you. The importation of Negroes of the African race from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states or territories of the United States of America is hereby forbidden, and Congress is required to pass such laws as shall effectually prevent the same. In other words, the Confederate States start off with a prohibition against importing slaves into the slave states. So the question is, what is this war really about, as opposed to what they say it's about? The South has started off, this is now some years later, this is 74 years later, when they draw up this Constitution, but the one that was drawn in 1787 recognized the importation of slaves, and it gave the states 20 years to hold off on banning it. They could pass no law by the Constitution until 1808, so it had a 20-year period in which no law could be passed to ban the importation of slaves in the United States. But since this Constitution being drafted and drawn up 74 years later, it starts off banning the slave trade. And I want you to be aware of that, because if that is true, then this is also true. If they are prohibiting the importation of slaves into the seceding states, and at the same time they are banning the importation of slaves, then that is a contradiction then, if this war is over slavery. Maybe you should go back and read the first veto of legislation passed by the President of the Confederate States. I think you know the name, Jefferson Davis. The first veto that was entered against bills passed by the Confederate Congress, the first veto by Jefferson Davis was a veto of the bill that was passed by Congress, the Confederate Congress, that would have abrogated the agreement of what I just read in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 of the Confederate Constitution. They tried to revise it so that slaves could be brought in if they had gone into another territory first, and then in the Confederate States, they were trying to say then we could let those slaves in. And Jefferson Davis vetoed that legislation, and it was not overridden by the Confederate Congress. I know that, so I know that this war is not over slavery. Because if it were, then the perpetuity of slavery would have had to have been further ensured, not only by the slaves replenishing their own numbers, but also by bringing other populations in from outside the country that would further expand the slave base in the southern states, and that did not occur. Now, I don't just have that to say about that. I want to read something that Abraham Lincoln said. And I want to read something I don't think people have read this either. See, we have not read the Confederate Constitution, which is a replica. It's made up of 7 articles, just as the original Constitution was made up of 7 articles. A preamble that reads pretty much the same way as a preamble to the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, that's almost the same. And many of the same words in almost all the areas, because all they're doing here is, in fact, deciding to make the Constitution more pure to what was intended by the framers. In other words, if you want to talk about patriots, don't leave out those persons in the South who were acting patriotically within the frame of what had been created at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The intention of the framers was to have small government, small taxation, and no taxation that was not equally applied to all the states. Now, I didn't put this on, I'm not going to put this on the screen, but I want to read something to you in the Constitution, because this is really what this war is about. I want to read to you Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. In fact, let me read. Let me. Maybe I could just put up there, John, on that section 1, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. Was that attached to clauses 2, 3, and 4 also, or is it just one by itself?
One by itself. Yeah.
One by itself. Okay. Yeah. Let me read then Article 1, Section 9, clauses 4, 5, and 6.
Wait a minute.
Let me read that then.
No, it's got Section 9.
If you can put it up there, that'd be good also.
Yeah, we got Section 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Article 1, Section 9.
Yeah, Section.
Clauses 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 8. Okay, we have all the way up to 8. So.
Because I want to show what this war is really about. This is a war that has the same particulars about it that the War of 1776 had. But if you don't know the language in the Constitution that's being defied, you will not understand the nature of this war. This war is not over slavery. This war is over the same objection that the War of 1776 was, and that was a war of taxation. And this war is over taxation also. So let me read Article 1, Section 9. I'm going to go to 4, 5, and 6 of that, clauses 4, 5, and 6 of Article 1, Section 9. 1, 2, 3. So let me read this to you. I'll start with, let me read 4 first. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. Now what that means is that any taxes that are levied must be equally levied among all of the states proportionally. You can't have any states being taxed disproportionately, because that then treats the states unfairly based upon their separate sovereignty claims. So this limits the government from the way it taxes the states. Keep that in mind. That's 4. Here's 5. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. Okay, let's think about that for a minute. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. The South is exporting products to Europe and other parts of the world. When they get to export their goods to other parts of the world, because the northern states have put a tax on the imports, you see, the federal government cannot tax exports. That's a prohibition here, isn't it? No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. So you cannot export tax. You cannot have an export tax. The idea is that we don't want the government putting a direct tax, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. 5 says, no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. The federal government cannot, even today, tax exports. The South is exporting goods to Europe. Europe is importing goods into the United States. Okay, we're going to take a break in about a minute, and when you do that, you take your break from WFOV. We will try to stay around in the same area that we are before you leave, and when you come back, hopefully won't be too far away from where we were when you left. We'll see you on the other side of the break in 4 minutes, and we'll be glad to have you back when you come back in 4 minutes. Okay, so the point I'm making here is that exports cannot be taxed in this country, but the South is an exporting part of the United States. And the manufacturing, which is in the North, is just getting started. So then what the North is doing is that they are, in fact, passing an import tax in order to protect the infantile, meaning the infancy of the factories that are being developed in this country, and they're giving the factories protection because they can't compete in their infancy with the factories already developed in Europe. Because Europe has already had its industrial revolution that started in 1833 in Britain, for example. And they are well off the ground, and when the North is getting its industries off the ground, they're just starting, so the competition is too heavy. So they put a tax on imports coming into the country. That then puts a tax on the goods that are coming out of Europe. But if you look at it carefully, you can see something going on here that frustrates what's in Article 1, Section 9, Clauses 4, 5, and 6. I read 4 and 5. Let me read 6. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. So the imports are going into the northern states. The exports are going from the southern states. So the South is paying an import tax in countries like Europe, the European countries. They in turn are paying the tax that they're getting from the South. They're paying that for the import of their goods into the northern states. So you see the circular problem here. The South is paying for, through a backdoor approach, the South is paying for the prosperity of the North. That's just not mouse talking. Let me read it to you out of this book here. Francis Springer's book, War for What? Here's what Springer says. And it's a flaw that he's talking about at the Constitution Convention. There was a fundamental weakness in the Union, a built-in stress that would eventually burst the nation at its seams. A fatal mistake had been made at the Constitution Convention of 1787. Among other proposals, Virginia had offered an amendment that would require a 2/3 vote. Listen carefully to this part here. A 2/3 vote for Congress to enact laws regulating commerce and navigation, including levying import duties. With most of the manufacturing in the North and production of raw materials in the South, especially cotton, for the North's all-important textile industry, tariffs needed a careful balancing to prevent a hardship on one section of the country as opposed to the other. In other words, this is a formula waiting for it to meet disaster. Okay, we want to welcome you back now from WFOV. And we normally have all of our viewers come back, so we're very glad that you came back this time as well. And we're not very far, as we promised. We'll not be too far away from where we were when you left. This is a taxation war. But the taxation is more covert. It's like, they can't tax disproportionately inside the country. But if you have the export and the import relationship such that the South is disproportionately taxed, then that amounts to the same thing, but it's just done in a more covert way. You can see here, if you understand that the South is exporting and paying an import tax where it's exporting its goods, the countries that are importing goods into the country are paying an import tax, which they're getting it from the South, and the South money that they're paying for taxes to be paid on their exports. When they import goods from Europe into the North, the money from the South is then going into the Northern coffers. In other words, the South is paying for the prosperity of the North. It's a taxation war. And the taxation war is not as direct as it was with Great Britain, but the South has figured this thing out. They are, in fact, being taxed through the tariffs. And government, by the way, loves tariffs. You know, even Donald Trump is trying to see, even what Donald Trump is doing poses a burden. I understand the need to make countries have not only you say free trade, but you want to have fair trade. I understand that. They're taxing our goods going into Canada, for example, at a certain rate, and we're taxing their goods coming in this country at a lower rate. So if that goes on, then of course the disproportionality, we can't export our goods because we can't sell it in another market, and they're bringing goods in here and dumping in our market, and the taxes are lower here than they are when we export our goods. We pay a higher rate to import it into other countries. I understand that. But the tariff, when you put a tariff in there, the tariff money doesn't go to the corporations or to the workers. It goes to the federal coffers. Yep. So when you have a tariff on goods coming to the country, the government puts that money in the federal treasury, and the cost of the tax goes to the American people.
Did you ever remember when Ross Perot ran for president? He used to say how he's going to try to handle trade treaties and say, the same deal we give you, you give to us. And I mean, thing is, I don't like tariffs because all costs are passed on to the consumer. I don't care if it's tariffs and customs or taxation or taxing the rich or whatever. When you tax the rich eternally, they're just going to flee somewhere else. They got the ability to do it.
Yeah, John, the tax is paid for it drives up the price of goods that the American consumers have to pay. But the beneficiaries of the tariff is the government. The government puts more money in the federal coffers, and the burden of that taxation falls on the higher prices of those goods that are falling on the American people, who have to pay a higher price for products because of the import tax. The tariff is a tax on imports, and the cost of that importation tax is added to the cost of the product.
Either way, though, either through tariffs or
and they
customs.
love to do that, by the way, because they can hide their hands and blame the other party for it.
Right. See, but another thing is, too, they always, too, that you have people saying, well, the rich don't pay their fair share. I think I remember a guy named Barney Frank saying that. Well, then if you actually look at his history of his time in office, he helped to write a large portion of the tax code he was alluding to. Okay? So, but see, all forms of added things are going to be passed on ultimately to consumer. If it's tariffs and customs, or if it's taxes, it's going to be, it's going to be added on and passed on by the producers or the sellers. They're going to have to pass that on. And you can't make people realize, they say tax the rich, tax this. Ultimately, everything you put on them is going to come back and bite you. That's right. What they cannot understand,
John, you understand it. I have to tell you something. John and I have a lot of discussions off camera. I marvel at the information that John has. Very well read. I always tell him that he should be teaching some of these college courses. It is it's amazing how much reading has been done outside of the classroom, and that's where your education really starts, when you start reading on your own and you're reading outside the box. This taxation and the way it's handled by the government is really interesting, how they use the taxation red banners, the red flag, so to speak, to make it appear that the rich are getting away with murder, so to speak, in terms of taxation. They're not paying their fair share. The rich aren't paying their fair share. Or when they cut taxes, they talk about the tax breaks went to the rich. You know, I hear these silly politicians making these claims about the rich aren't paying their fair share. The rich are paying, in the federal government coffers, the rich are paying all the taxes in this country. They never tell you what is considered to be a fair share. 1% of all of the top 1% of all income earners in this country, 1%, the top 1%, are paying 40% of the taxes. It's really like 38.7%, but almost 40% of the taxes in the country, federal taxes. So the top 1% are paying about 40% of federal taxes in the United States. The top 5% of income earners are paying 60% of the taxes, and the top 10% are paying 70% of the taxes. So it stands to reason, doesn't it, that if you have the top 10% paying 60 or more percent of all the federal taxes that are being paid, any tax break by definition will go to the rich. Since if you're not paying taxes or paying very small amounts of money into the coffers, then, I mean, proportionally to your income, then obviously when you have tax breaks, more of the tax breaks go to those who are paying the taxes, and that is the rich, who they tax as the top 10% taxes 60% to 70% of all the taxes are at the top 10% income level. And they do that because if they put the taxes at the lower level where the majority and mass of the people are, you would have the same thing happening in this country now that happened in 1776 or happened in 1861 when we had another tax revolt. Because we've had many, many tax revolts in this country, and every last one of them has been covered up, except the one in 1776. And that's because we're fighting an outside agent. In terms of the inside tax agents, the American people rising up against them has been hidden from public view, such as the so-called Civil War. We have not had a civil war in this country, and that's remarkable given how outlandish and how much of an outlaw government these politicians are running in this country right now. It's amazing that the American people take it's amazing that we take what we're taking from what's happening in Washington. But we've had many tax revolts in the United States, and each one of them has either been covered up or they've been misconstrued as something other than what they were. The War of 1861 to 1865 was not a civil war, and it certainly was not over slavery. And let me read to you, in case you have a problem with that, because I know what's been taught. I know what people are saying, all the professors, most of them are nothing but parrots. You know, monkey see, monkey do. And they're all saying the same thing about when I say all, obviously I'm not saying everybody. All in the sense the numbers are overwhelming on one side, and you don't have hardly anyone on the other side saying something different. Most of these scholars would say that the Civil War was fought over slavery. And that is so wrong and so you have to be misinformed to say things like that. Because you can't have a war over slavery when you have slavery in the states that's fighting the South. There were 15 states that had slaves in the United States at the time of the so-called Civil War. 7 of them go out before the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, who was inaugurated March the 4th, 1861. And when Lincoln decided to use force against those 7 states, 4 other states went out of the Union. So of the 15 states that had slaves in those states in 1861, 11 of them went out and seceded from the Union. That means that 4 states then did not succeed, and they have slaves in the Union. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, those 4 Union states had slaves, and neither one of those states left the Union during this war. So you scholars have got to explain then, as Ricky Ricardo would say, you got some explaining to do. How can a war be over slavery when slavery is in the states that are fighting against the seceding states? How can it be over slavery when that war on both sides has slaves in both sides of that war? Slaves in the 11 succeeding states, slaves in 4 of the Union states. Can't be over slavery. Something is wrong here. And you scholars have some explaining to do. I'm going to explain it through reading Abraham Lincoln's own words in his first inaugural address. All the scholars love to talk about Abraham Lincoln, and they love to talk about his inaugural address when he says, "With malice toward none, charity for all, in the right, in which God allows us to see the right." And they want to act like that's what Abraham Lincoln said in 1861 when he gave his first inaugural address. That's not what Lincoln said in 1861. Lincoln said that said that on March the 4th, 1865, in his second inaugural address. In his first inaugural address, here's what Lincoln said. I'll just read a part of it. This is Lincoln's inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. He says, "I do not consider it necessary at present for me to discuss these matters of administration about which there is no special anxiety or excitement. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There's never been, this is Lincoln talking, there's never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension." Lincoln is talking about slavery, but the South is not talking about slavery, and he doesn't understand that they're talking about 2 different things here. The South is not succeeding over slavery. That's Lincoln's face on this war, on this secession. There's never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence is to the contrary, has all of the while existed and been open to their inspections. In other words, Lincoln is very clear about slavery not being in jeopardy in the states where it exists. And he's saying to the South that his comments are open to anyone that wants to inspect what he said here, because Lincoln has been saying consistently that this is not what he was about, this idea of emancipating slaves. It is found in nearly all, listen carefully, it is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. Lincoln's position on slavery is found, he's saying here, in almost all of the speeches he's made on that topic in public. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that, and here's what Lincoln is quoting in his speech, that is what he said before, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe that no lawful right, I believe I have no lawful right to do so, which that's true. Slavery is recognized in the Constitution, so he has no lawful right to interfere with it. But then, looking at Lincoln's intention, he says this also, and I have no inclination to do so. So legally, he's constrained from doing so, but Lincoln also is not inclined to do it, even if he had the legal right to do so. I'll read it again, because that may be very surprising. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. And he goes on and make a lot of other points along the same line, even saying that he'd be willing to propose an amendment or support an amendment to make slavery a permanent feature in the United States, which would have been the 13th Amendment, by the way. And the irony is that the 13th Amendment later on would be proposed and ratified in 1865 that will, in fact, end slavery on the soil of the United States, but only in the aftermath of a war in which 620,000 Americans had died. But to say this war is over slavery is to take what happened in the aftermath of the war and then place it at the forefront of the war, which is the same sleight of hand trick that magicians do with the pea under the shells. You know, when they move the pea around, what they did here was reverse it so it seems that the beginning point of this war is a war with slavery, although the end result of it is that the 13th Amendment was passed, but it was passed in 1865 when war was finally ended on the soil of the United States. I'm only making that point to bring Lincoln in, more so into focus, because I wanted to bring to you a book not taught on any of the classes in the United States, no university classes and no high school classes, certainly. This is another book written by the great Loyola University professor Thomas DiLorenzo. And the book is called The Real Lincoln, which follows the other book they put out about Lincoln called Lincoln Unmasked. You follow that up with the book called The Real Lincoln. The subtitle of it is A New Look at Abraham Lincoln, His Agenda, and an Unnecessary War. 620,000 Americans died. And these parrots, these scholars, have placed this man as the greatest president this country has produced. You got to be kidding.
In the 60s, did you ever see the episode of Star Trek where they had Abraham Lincoln come on board the ship of the Enterprise? Oh yeah, they were like, it was like a very, in a way, they indoctrinated us, to believe this guy was so. And if you look at just the fact that there was the rule of law, the constitutional law, and all these prohibitions for what he did, and he did everything he did everything a tyrant would do. I mean, John Wilkes Booth, was it John? Yeah, John Wilkes Booth, make sure I get the right assassin. He was right in calling him a tyrant. Not right for killing him, but he was a tyrant.
He was a tyrant. Abraham Lincoln was this country's first tyrant. You know who the second one was, John?
I would say FDR, but
John, I can't stop him. I can't stop him, folks. And isn't it interesting that those two presidents, the 16th president and the 33rd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yep.
We've had two dictators of this country. The South, there's a book called The South Was Right by two North Carolina scholars, the Kennedy brothers, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy, twins. They wrote this book called The South Was Right. They also got a book out called, and this is going to certainly raise some eyebrows, it's a book called, well, that's a question in this case here, was Jefferson Davis right? Now, I know everybody's going to be upset thinking that this is a call for the continuation of slavery in the United States. Pure nonsense. The reason that De Lorenzo says this was an unnecessary war is because slavery was going to end anyway. And it was going to end because it was going to be ended by where it was ended everywhere else. It was going to be ended by capitalism. It was going to be ended by the Industrial Revolution.
I think Upton Sinclair said it one time. I think it was Upton Sinclair, the Jungle. He was the one that wrote The Jungle, right? Oh yeah, he said when he wrote The Jungle, he was writing to hit people's heart, but he actually hit him in the stomach because the result of it was the passing of the free, pure food laws and all that stuff. But he was talking about the conditions that the people was working at. That's what he was aiming at, how bad that was and how egregious that was. And it ended up in what happened was, but it helped us out. It helped us out, but it wasn't the intended purpose. So basically, it's the same thing. I mean, it's like it would have fallen by the wayside. Not that capitalism didn't have abuses, but it would have freed them up from trying to purchase. That's what people were back then. It was a labor source. You don't have to purchase. You just pay them a marginal amount of money, and you won't have to care for them the rest of their lives like you would in slavery. And what wasn't done because of humanitarian interest is because it had affected their pocketbook, their bottom line. So I mean, it's that's about humans. You have to appeal them where they're at, motivating. That's usually money.
5 million people, the equivalent of 5 million people, based upon the comparative population at that time to population today, 620,000 persons dying in this war would be equivalent to 5 million persons. That's a Holocaust. And they have hidden the real Lincoln behind the mask of this war being fought over slavery to make it appear that there was some humanitarian motive behind this war. This war was a war over taxation. And the South was fighting against the unfair taxation through the tariff policies of the United States. And they risen up after threatening to do so over a course of time, 1824, 1828, 1832. Finally, in 1861, they succeeded because of the unfair taxation policies. And when they left, Lincoln said that the taxation would, in fact, be due. They left in April. You pay your taxes. Most of you are aware of the fact that you're paying your taxes today, the last day to get them in. Today before you have to have both postmarked by 12 o'clock tonight. April 15th. You can see the problem here. The South is succeeding after Lincoln is inaugurated March the 4th and takes office at that time. In April, the taxes are due. And the South is out of the Union. 11 states have succeeded eventually. And they're outside the tax base of the United States. And so in effect, what it means is that close to 2 million soldiers that would fight this war during that 4-year period of time are now out in the field as tax collectors. We started that way at the beginning of the country. We're now back at it again in 1861 with the same thing. Now, one other thing before we get off the air is this. I want to show this picture because I want you to see here that this notion that this country is racist to the core and all of that, all these accusations about America being racist. I want you to see something here. This map right here just proves that allegation. Because if this country was racist, first of all, you wouldn't have people making it up like this Mollett did. But look at this map here. These states in red are the states that voted for John McCain in 2008. The blue states are the ones that voted for Barack Obama. Only 3 states out of the 11 states of the South where the Civil War was fought because they succeeded. Only 3 of those states voted for Barack Obama. If Barack Obama's election were a matter of the civil rights movement, we would have seen it here. He's not president because of the civil rights movement. Where the civil rights movement was fought in this area here, Barack Obama did not carry these states. Only Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia voted for Barack Obama. The other 8 states did not vote for Barack Obama. He's elected because of the fundamental fairness of the American people. And the reason why the South didn't vote for Barack Obama was because by this time the South is Republican. We have to know what's going on here, people. We cannot let these people continue to lead us by our nose and get us fighting against each other over this nonsense. Okay, I got to get out of here. So let me wrap this up, and I'll tell you I'll see you next week. We're going to continue this discussion next week. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.